Winter always brings out the Hobbit in me. There's nothing better than curling up by a roaring fire with a hot beverage and a good book. And for ages now, I've wanted to level up my wintry, hobbity aesthetic with a right proper housecoat. And regardless of how one might feel about the plot of the Hobbit trilogy as a whole, we can all agree that Bilbo's Patchwork housecoat is seriously epic, peak Hobbit goals. And after seeing Shannon Makes, the solo artist, and Cosplay Cyanide create stunning renditions, I was hit with inspiration and determination that I too would possess a magnificent hobbity housecoat. So first, let's talk fabric. Obviously, this project is not going to be one-to-one screen accurate, but I wanted as close a feel to the original as I could possibly get, which means we're going for earth tones, jewel tones, linens, velvets, brocades, jacquards, floral patterns, subtle plaids, that sort of thing. Anything that looks like it would be at home in Middle-earth. That also means I avoided bleached white, glaring pastels, sequins, glitter, and modern-looking flowy organzas. I also wanted this to be as much of a stash-busting project as possible. I originally planned to make it exclusively from off-cut scraps from my personal projects, but it very quickly became obvious that at this point in time, that would be a little overly ambitious. The sheer amount of pieces needed is way more than what I had in my scrap bag, and I knew that meant it would either take a long time to make, or I would need to be a little more flexible in my fabric choices. So the rule I settled on was no new yardage. I wasn't allowed to go out and buy brand new fabric at a retail store just for the patchwork. But that did mean I could thrift yardage, I could use someone else's scraps, and if I had a project in mind for the remaining yardage, I could steal a few inches from some of the yardage in my stash. After all, it's in my stash, which means past me paid for it, which means it's basically free, right? And so this ended up being an amalgamation of my own past and future projects, a few thrifted scraps, and a whole bunch of cabbage from a particularly awesome stash. If you've seen my crazy quilt video, you know that in December of 2023, I picked up 2 tote bags of scraps from the costume department of Murdoch Mysteries. A good chunk of scraps went into making my crazy quilt, but I saved the most hobbity pieces to include in the housecoat. So let's begin our journey, starting with the patchwork. From what we can see, there is no definitive pattern to the patchwork of the housecoat. So without a baseline to start, it would be very easy to feel completely overwhelmed. Thankfully, when Shannon Makes made her patchwork housecoat, she digitized her pattern, which works really well for giving that random patchwork effect without the headache. I've linked her pattern and video in the description for anyone that wants to give it a try. So that is what I'm starting with, and these pattern pieces do not have seam allowance, which gives you flexibility on how much you cut. I normally go with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but for the patchwork portion of this project, I went with the quilting standard of a 1/4 inch. To say it felt nerve-wracking would be an understatement, but with the amount of fabric you're working with here, a 1/2 inch seam allowance would simply add too much bulk. One thing I will recommend if you are looking to make your own patchwork housecoat is cut your pieces in stages. I am actually glad that it took me as long as it did to acquire all the fabrics, because if I had sat down with all my fabric and said, I am going to cut out all these pieces today, I would have either been way too daunted and given up, or I would have hyperfixated and given myself a serious repetitive strain injury, which I may have done that anyway. So do a little bit each day rather than all at once. And for my fellow floor trolls, do not sit on the floor for this. I attempted this once and really messed up my lower back. So use a good chair and a good table, take breaks, and change your posture regularly. Some of the fabrics were lightweight or had details that would fray easily, so I backed them with fusible interfacing to give a bit more stability. For this embroidered satin, I stitched around the seam lines as well to make sure the embroidery didn't fray. And finally, after months of acquiring, marking, and cutting out fabric, we have just over 1,850 patchwork pieces, which means it's time to start assembling. This project is a good exercise in not overthinking. It would be so easy to spend hours matching up fabrics, but sometimes if it looks good, and you need to pin it and move on. I did make sure the pairings were harmonious and generally went for complementary color choices as opposed to contrasting. The first pieces to get paired are the little squares. These obviously do not have 1/4 inch seam allowances at this point. I originally thought I could just cut whatever and then trim it down. In hindsight, it would have been far more productive to just mark the seam allowance at the time and cut it neatly then. Once I ran out of pins, I started sewing the little squares together. And to save on time and thread, I didn't bother cutting between each square at the time. Instead, I just added the next pair in line, making some fantastically hobbity bunting. One trick I found handy was to keep a magnetic needle minder on my sewing machine. That way, as I removed the pins from each square as I sewed, they would stay contained. This made things much more efficient. Then it was time to snip apart my long strand of bunting. And this is when I realized it would be better to trim down all my seam allowances now. I am so glad I picked up a quilting ruler last year. It is certainly earning its keep. Trimming everything down was very satisfying, but in the same way as the initial marking and cutting should be done with frequent breaks, this too should also be done with frequent breaks. Otherwise, your neck and shoulders will be screeching like a Nazgul when you're done. Another unexpected bonus to my new sewing room layout, I can keep an open garbage bin right beside the sewing table so scraps can be swept off with ease. Then all the little squares get pressed. I had planned to press all my seams open, but as I progressed through the project, I ended up switching to nested seams, pressing to one side or the other, depending on the fabric. One thing I did not count on when I started this project was how much floof it would generate, and that's just the nature of working with scraps of varying fiber content. Anytime I did anything with these scraps, there were little threads and fluffs all over the place. So my handy hack, get thee a lint roller. This made cleanup so much easier, and I could do a quick spot clean every few minutes as I was pressing. The little squares then get joined to the next size up, which are the little rectangles. And I used a lot of random half-finished spools and bobbins to help destash my thread bin. Making the patchwork was by far the most time-consuming process of the entire project. joining large squares to little rectangles, large rectangles to smaller pieces, all gradually coming together to make 8 by 8 inch squares that would eventually become fabric in the shapes of my pattern pieces. And yes, pressing your seams is absolutely 100% crucial in a project like this. One time saver I found was using something wooden as a tailor's clapper. This holds down the pressed edges while they cool and helps the newly pressed seam stay crisp. As I don't have a proper one yet, I used the next best thing. At this point, I realized I had made a slight miscalculation when cutting out my pieces. While, yes, I did have the right total number of pieces, I didn't have the right number of the individual shapes. I had far too many of the largest rectangles and nowhere near enough of the little bitty squares and the smallest rectangles. Thankfully, I was able to turn some of the extra largest pieces into smaller pieces. Thank goodness it wasn't the other way around. Then I would have been, as they say, up the mountain without a burglar. Then it was rinse and repeat the previous steps to make up enough lil pieces. Then progress could really be made, and this is when I could start to see the end result in my head. Excuse me. The pieces grew steadily larger, looking more and more quilt-like. And it was so satisfying to see the finished stack of squares. Since seam allowances inevitably shift around, I made an 8 by 8 inch template and trimmed all the edges so that everything would go together nicely. For lining fabric, I thrifted a lovely cotton flannel bedsheet, and the oak motifs feel delightfully hobbity. I had already done a quick mock-up to ensure the correct fit, so I could then quickly cut out all the lining pieces and stitch it together. This particular pattern is actually fairly easy to assemble, if you're not literally making your own fabric for it. I figured the sleeve pieces were an easy place to start, so I put together a few sets of squares and got trimming. I have to say, after spending 4 months putting squares together, to now be cutting them apart felt a little counterintuitive, and there was a little part of my brain going, no! As you can see, the squares aren't quite large enough to reach the widest points of the sleeve, so I used some of the cut-off pieces to fill in the gap. Then I decided it was time to tackle the skirt. I did a rough count of how many squares I'd need, and then began placing them out. I started by assembling strips, and then the strips got stitched together to form a panel. Once the panel was ready, I could cut out my skirt. And then I repeated that process 3 more times. I made sure to run a gathering thread at the top of all my sleeve pieces to ensure an even fit. Then I stitched up the center seam on both the lining and outer fabrics. Then I tackled the front bodice, and once again there's a little missing piece, so thank goodness for scraps. I definitely jumped around from step to step in this project, so after I pinned my sleeves into place, I stitched together the skirt panels. A tiny detail on Bilbo's housecoat is that the cuffs and collar have a piped edge, so I procrastinated putting in sleeves by making some piping trim. In the interest of stash busting, I made my own piping trim using bias cuts of my lining fabric. I braided some yarn for the cording and carefully stitched along the folded edge. Usually you need a zipper foot or a piping foot, but I have neither, so I set my sewing machine foot as far to the left as it would go. Then I was ready to tackle the sleeves, and I decided to sew them by hand using small back stitches. The cuffs, collar, and belt are all made from burgundy velvet, and I was fortunate enough to find a lovely amount at the local Value Village. I did a quick mock-up of the collar and then was ready to assemble. The belt was fairly easy to put together, as long as I pinned it within an inch of its life. Because of how velvet is made, it tends to wobble and shift if you look at it funny, so copious pins or basting is the way to go. The belt gets sewn almost all the way around, and then flipped right sides out, and I finished the opening gap by hand. The collar gets the piping attached first on the right side of one piece, and then the second collar half gets attached, right sides facing. Since all the various fabrics are kinda heavy, I trimmed down the seam allowance to avoid bulk. Then it gets pinned and sewn to the neck edge. And yes, I am carefully sewing over my pins. Not a habit I like to do, but it does prevent the velvet from shifting out of place, and knock on wood, I have yet to break a needle. I sewed the cuffs in the same way, piping first on one side, then the second side gets added. Seam allowances trimmed, and then I could pin them to the cuffs. I thought about using the machine for one side of sewing, but it was getting quite challenging to wrangle at this point, so I opted for hand sewing. Now, I know Bilbo wore this housecoat before he went on his adventure and found the ring, but presumably he wore it after he returned as well. And if I were a hobbit who found a magical ring, I would want to keep it somewhere close by, but also somewhere special, even if I were merely lounging about my hobbit hole. I was inspired by the watch pockets in Victorian walking skirts and decided to include a little non-canonical addition, a tiny pocket on the inside of the bodice. And if one is making a pocket for the precious, I think the pocket itself should be made of equally precious fabric. In a similar way that I bought Murdoch Mysteries scraps, I also bought a bag of tiny scraps of costumes from the Broadway production of Phantom of the Opera. A lot of these are too tiny to sew with, but will make some excellent jewelry. So I picked out what larger pieces I could find and used the crazy quilt method to patch together a tiny pocket. It got a lining to give it strength, and then it was ready to be sewn inside the housecoat. Speaking of pockets, Bilbo does appear to have 2 large pockets on the outside, so I took a couple of spare squares and scraps of velvet and whipped them up into pockets. They got attached just below the waistline, and sewing these on with all that skirt fabric was quite a feat. I popped the lining in and started by pinning the neckline edges together, folding the raw edge of the collar under to hide the edge of the lining. I flipped the sleeves inside out and finished them with some lovely silk thread. Then I was ready to tackle the collar, which was no small feat. I also stitched up the sides of the front with a complementary silk thread, and it was time for the slightly daunting task of the skirt hem. Gradually working my way from one side to the other, I folded in both the quilted edge and the lining edge, and Happy Helper insisted on helping. I took a minute to sew in the inner pocket before moving on to the hem. Which, for some reason that eludes me, I thought the best way would be to fell it down by hand. Yes, it looks beautiful in the moment, but it took so much time. Also, when I'm wearing it, some of the heavier fabrics kind of push outward, so I may go back and add a row of top stitching later on. And at long last, my housecoat is ready for an unexpected party. Well, That was quite the adventure. This was easily the most time-consuming project I have ever done. Sadly, I did not track the work hours on this like I did for my crazy quilt, but as an extremely rough guesstimate, I would say I easily spent at least 200 hours on this housecoat, which surpasses my Shindig Kaylee outfit by nearly double the amount of time. And considering that I was literally making the fabric to make the outfit, it's hardly surprising, but I am absolutely 100% delighted with how it turned out. It is perfectly Hobbity, peak aesthetic goals right here, and I will absolutely be wearing this every chance I get this winter and for many winters to come. It is definitely not a lightweight garment. It is essentially a wearable quilt, and I am so down for that. It's long enough that if I'm curled up on the couch, I can tuck my feet in and be cozy, and I love that I can look over it and pick out memories of projects that I've worked on, as well as past episodes of Murdoch Mysteries. We have a little bit of Margaret over here. We have some Bridesmaid over here. This one's been in a few episodes. We have some Shindig Kaylee on this sleeve. We have some Luthien. That's my very first YouTube video right there. We have some Beckenstein wool from one of my recent New York trips there that will eventually be a waistcoat. We have some Mystery Murdoch velvet on the corner there. If anybody knows what episode this is from and what character is wearing it, please tell me in the comments, because I love this and I've watched every single episode and I have no idea where it's from. So if you know, please let me know. So if you enjoyed my Hobbity adventure, please hit the like button, and if you want to see more projects like this, please consider subscribing. It's hard to believe, but this channel is almost at 5,000 subscribers, which is so awesome. If you'd like to support the channel, I do have a Ko-fi page, and I will see you all in the new year with more geekery meets history sewing adventures. And now, I'm gonna go take a nap and vacuum my sewing room. As they say, the road goes ever on. Happy New Year, friends.
Like, tell me you've never smoked a pipe without telling me you've never smoked a pipe.
Hi. Are you gonna be quiet? No, don't eat the fern. Don't eat the fern. Regardless of how... Are you gonna be quiet? You're gonna be a noisy brat, huh? No, usually you fall asleep while I'm doing this. You're ridiculous, you know that?
Yeah. Alright. That's why I don't smoke a pipe.
I know Bilbo wore this housecoat. Yeah, that's cute. No.
Okay. Puppy! Oh, the good Hobbit puppy.
Happy New Year, Fred. Really, Ruby?